You know, usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of clinical precision. It feels almost like engineering, right?
Yeah, very binary.
Exactly. Like you break your arm, the X-ray shows a jagged white line, and
Yeah.
the doctor just points to the screen and says, "Well, there it is. It's visible, it's binary." And honestly, it's comforting.
Right, because we crave that categorization. We really want a clear boundary between what's healthy and unhealthy, broken and whole.
But then you step into the world of neurodevelopment or, personality traits and trauma, and suddenly that X-ray machine is just entirely useless. We're looking at a diagnostic landscape that is incredibly murky.
Hmm.
And that actually brings us to the core of our deep dive today. We are looking at this massive, honestly, incredibly dense stack of sources today. We've got qualitative interviews with survivors, neurobiology studies on trauma, and this really fascinating workplace behavioral data from San Diego State University.
Yeah, that workplace data is wild.
It really is. And we're using all of this to decode a word that gets thrown around so casually today, which is narcissism.
It really has become the catch-all term for just, well, bad behavior, hasn't it?
Totally.
Like someone takes too many selfies or they're a little arrogant in a Zoom meeting, and immediately they get branded a narcissist. But the research we're looking at draws a very sharp line. True narcissistic personality disorder, or NPD, is a clinical diagnosis that only affects about 1 to 5% of the population.
Which means it's actually quite rare in its full-blown clinical form.
Right.
But here's the catch that the research highlights over and over again. You don't actually need a clinical diagnosis to cause absolute devastation.
No, you really don't.
Because narcissistic tendencies, things like intense self-absorption, a severe lack of emotional empathy, and this desperate, almost survival-level need for control, those all exist on a spectrum. And having strong traits on that spectrum is, well, it's staggeringly common.
And that distinction is just so vital for you, the listener, to grasp right out of the gate. Because most people dealing with a toxic ex or a manipulative parent or just a boss who makes their life miserable, they aren't usually up against a diagnosable psychopath.
Right, they're facing individuals operating with heavy narcissistic traits.
Exactly. And the psychological damage inflicted by those specific traits on the healthy people around them is profoundly real. It's measurable and it's systemic.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because our mission today isn't just about sticking pop psychology labels on people, it's about decoding the hidden mechanics. We want to understand the how and the why.
The actual machinery of it.
Right, like how do these behaviors operate? Why do they so effectively trap healthy, intelligent people? We are going to map the profound psychological, professional, and literal biological toll this takes on the people caught in a narcissist's orbit. And of course, equip you with the tools to actually protect yourself.
Absolutely. And to understand how healthy people get affected by this dynamic, we first have to examine the architecture of the trap itself.
The lure.
Yeah, the lure.
Yeah.
And the sources point out that this is most visibly engineered in romantic relationships through a highly predictable cycle. It goes idealize, devalue, and discard.
And most people probably know that first phase as love bombing.
Right, love bombing.
We hear that term all the time on social media, but the sources dive into the actual mechanism of love bombing. And it isn't just someone being overly affectionate.
No, not at all.
It's basically an intel gathering operation wrapped in romance. They are flooding the target with lavish gifts, fast commitments, telling you that you are their soulmate within like 3 weeks. It makes me think of an emotional Ponzi scheme.
Oh, I love that analogy.
Yeah, like they're paying out these massive, unsustainable psychological dividends up front to get you to invest your entire emotional baseline into the relationship.
That is an incredibly accurate way to look at it. The mechanism here is literally about hacking the human attachment system.
Wow, hacking it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
By providing an overwhelming flood of positive reinforcement, they create a rapid, completely artificial dependency. They aren't building a genuine connection. They are systematically mapping your vulnerabilities.
So they're looking for the cracks.
Right. They learn what you crave, whether that's security or validation or even just adventure, and they mirror it back to you perfectly.
And the data on the timeline of this phase is just fascinating. Surveys of love bombing victims reveal that this intense, idealized phase is remarkably short.
very short.
The average duration is only about 5.5 months with narcissistic men and 3.5 months with narcissistic women. It almost universally maxes out and collapses around the 6-month mark.
Because maintaining a curated, flawless mask of perfection is neurologically exhausting.
It takes too much energy.
Exactly. It's a high-energy performance that simply cannot be sustained long-term.
But wait, let me push back on this for a second because the line seems dangerously blurry to me.
Okay, sure.
If you are just someone who falls fast and hard, a hopeless romantic, how do you know you aren't just in the honeymoon phase? What is the actual mechanical difference between a genuinely excited new partner and a narcissistic love bomber?
That's a great question. The differentiator is basically how they process boundaries.
Okay.
A healthy infatuation, no matter how intense it gets, still recognizes you as an autonomous individual.
Yeah.
So if you tell a healthy partner, hey, I'm exhausted, I need to stay home alone tonight, they adapt.
They might be bummed, but they get it.
Right. But a narcissist interprets that boundary as an existential threat to the dependency they're trying to build.
Right.
The pushback to that boundary won't be just disappointment. It will be punitive.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they will guilt trip you, accuse you of betrayal, or just withdraw their affection entirely. And that brings us to the psychological shift, which is the devalue phase.
The moment the Ponzi scheme collapses.
Exactly. Once the emotional investment is secured, the mirroring just stops. The affection is abruptly replaced by criticism, isolation, and degradation.
It's like a switch flips.
It really is. There's this poignant quote from the qualitative research from a woman who endured this. She said, "Our early relationship felt like a fairy tale. I had never been adored and idealized before and was totally sucked in. But after several months, the lectures started, and he would spend hours criticizing me, blaming me for everything."
Man, that is heavy. And this is where we really need to elevate the conversation because most people know the terms for what happens next, things like gaslighting or intermittent reinforcement.
Right.
But the sources explain why these tactics are so devastating. Gaslighting isn't just lying, it is a systematic attack on a victim's reality testing apparatus.
Yeah, that's a crucial distinction.
When a manipulator constantly says, well, I never said that, or you're just imagining things, they're forcing the victim to outsource their perception of reality to the abuser.
It creates profound cognitive dissonance. The victim's brain is basically holding two completely conflicting truths at the same time. One is, I remember this happening, and the other is, the person who loves me says I'm crazy.
And to resolve that tension,
To resolve that dissonance and maintain the attachment, the victim often just sacrifices their own reality.
and the intermittent reinforcement mechanism explains why they don't just pack up and leave. It operates exactly like a slot machine.
Totally.
The narcissist suddenly drops the criticism and gives you a tiny glimpse of that love bombing phase again, like a great weekend or a heartfelt apology.
And boom, dopamine.
Right. The victim gets this massive spike of dopamine, and it wires their brain to keep pulling the lever, just hoping for a jackpot that doesn't actually exist. You end up internalizing the blame, thinking, if I can just be a little bit better, I can fix this.
Which is the ultimate goal for the abuser. Complicity.
Wow.
The manipulator wants you to police yourself so they don't have to put in the effort to do it.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Because this cytological erosion isn't just contained to your thoughts, the neurobiology studies we have here show that this translates directly into physical, biological degradation.
It's terrifying, honestly.
We aren't just talking about stress, we are talking about literal brain changes. Can you explain what is actually happening in the brain here?
Yeah, this is probably the most alarming part of the data. When you are subjected to unpredictable emotional manipulation, your HPA axis, that's the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, is constantly firing.
It's stuck in the on position.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Your body is perpetually in a state of fight or flight, which floods your entire system with cortisol. Now, cortisol is a vital hormone if you're trying to, say, escape a tiger. But it is highly neurotoxic when it stays in your brain chronically.
It literally acts like an acid on specific neural pathways, right?
Yes, exactly like an acid. The chronic cortisol physically degrades the synaptic connections in the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of your brain responsible for executive function, logic, and judgment.
So you literally can't think straight.
Right. And simultaneously, it attacks the hippocampus, which is the brain's memory center.
Which perfectly explains the mechanism behind the brain fog that survivors always report. They aren't just confused. Their memory center is physically shrinking under the toxic load of these stress hormones. They literally cannot encode the memories of the abuse properly.
Meanwhile, the amygdala, which is the brain's fear and threat detection center, undergoes hypertrophy.
Meaning it gets bigger.
It grows larger and becomes hyperactive. You see threats everywhere. The physical toll of this altered brain state is immense. The research links this chronic nervous system dysregulation to severe insomnia, gastrointestinal collapse, and even the triggering of autoimmune diseases.
That is just wild.
What's fascinating here is the disconnect in the medical field. Victims frequently show up at their primary care doctors with migraines or chronic fatigue or mysterious rashes, and they receive treatments for the symptoms.
Right, they get a pill for the headache.
Yeah, but neither the patient nor the doctor realizes the root cause is an emotional manipulator sitting right there in their living room.
The environment itself is making them physically sick.
Exactly.
But that HPA axis activation doesn't care if you're in a bedroom or a boardroom. This exact same dynamic thrives absolutely anywhere. There are hierarchies, power differentials, and a flow of resources.
Oh, definitely.
And the workplace behavioral data from San Diego State University paints a truly terrifying picture of the corporate narcissist.
The modern corporate structure is essentially a playground custom built to reward narcissistic traits, especially if leadership isn't vigilant.
And the infiltration starts right at the interview stage. The data shows narcissists consistently outperform healthy individuals in job interviews.
Which makes perfect sense when you think about it.
Right, because an interview is essentially a sanctioned love bombing session.
Yep.
They exude unshakable confidence, they are absolute masters of self-promotion, and they lack the self-doubt that plagues normal candidates. So to a hiring manager, they just look like a visionary, self-motivated leader.
They project an intoxicating illusion of competence. But the organizational psychology research reveals a stark contrast once they are actually inside the company. They don't actually build anything, they extract.
They extract.
Yes, they dismantle psychological safety, creating environments that are intensely competitive and entirely devoid of collaborative integrity.
And the San Diego State research highlights how they do this because you might assume a narcissist is the one screaming at interns or throwing staplers across the room, but direct bullying leaves a paper trail.
Right, HR can track a screaming match.
Exactly. So instead, they utilize indirect bullying.
Plausible deniability is the corporate narcissist's best friend. The research identifies their primary mechanisms. They hoard critical information to create artificial bottlenecks. They spread subtle but malicious gossip to isolate high performers. And they claim credit for team successes while immediately scapegoating others for any failures.
The information hoarding is such a brilliant, dark tactic. By refusing to share the knowledge necessary for a project to succeed, they make themselves the indispensable gatekeeper.
It's honestly like a corporate parasite, because a biological parasite is often highly evolved to evade detection by the host's immune system.
Wow, that's a great way to frame it.
Right. Its entire existence depends on extracting resources, which, in the office, means narcissistic supply like praise, status, and control over others. It extracts all of this from the company and the coworkers without contributing any actual tangible value. The healthy employees are left doing the heavy lifting, while their prefrontal cortexes are bathing in cortisol, which obviously leads to massive burnout and staff turnover.
Yeah, it destroys the ecosystem. And we also have to examine how this manifests across gender dynamics because the societal framing of these behaviors dictates who gets punished and who gets promoted.
Right, the overt versus covert traits.
Exactly. The research shows that men generally score higher on measures of overt narcissism, so things like blatant entitlement, grandiosity, and exhibitionism. In traditional corporate hierarchies, these overt traits are often tragically mislabeled as entrepreneurial drive or assertiveness. So they're actively rewarded with promotions and stock options.
Frequently, yes. Women, conversely, navigate a much tighter tightrope regarding authority and assertiveness. The research indicates that women are disproportionately subjected to covert narcissism in the workplace, which creates this pervasive loop of incivility.
How does the covert version play out at work?
Well, covert narcissists are deeply insecure, but mask it with passive aggression. They interpret ambiguous situations as personal slights, and they react with subtle disrespect or exclusionary tactics.
Like leaving someone off an important email chain on purpose.
Exactly. And this slowly degrades the mutual norms of respect in an office, creating a toxic feedback loop that heavily damages the psychological safety of female employees.
It is just a staggering systemic failure. But let's take a step back and connect these environments. Because if a fully grown adult with a developed brain, an HR department, and the ability to just quit their job gets physically and psychologically ill from this dynamic, what happens to a child? A child whose entire biological survival depends on a narcissistic gatekeeper. The research on childhood enmeshment shows that being raised by a narcissist doesn't just hurt your feelings, it alters the fundamental blueprint of how you exist in the world.
It is the ultimate betrayal of the biological contract.
Hmm.
In a healthy family system, a parent is supposed to be a mirror that reflects the child's autonomy back to them, slowly fostering their independence. But in a narcissistic family system, the child is objectified. The child is not permitted to be an independent human being. They are merely an extension of the parent's ego.
And the sources outline a concept here called narcissistic enmeshment. It's basically a complete erasure of emotional boundaries.
Yeah, and enmeshment frequently takes the form of emotional incest.
Mm.
And to be unequivocally clear, the literature is not referring to physical abuse here, but an emotionally inappropriate, suffocating reliance.
Right.
The parent lacks the ability to self-soothe, so they use the child to regulate their own volatile emotions. This results in parentification.
Where the roles completely invert.
Exactly. The child becomes the confidant, the caretaker, the anxiety absorber for the adult. The child's own emotional development is suspended because there is literally no room for it.
And the qualitative research explores how this creates an impossible, crazy-making paradox for the child, because the parent projects two completely opposing demands.
Mm-hmm.
The first is, you must achieve greatness to make me look good because your success is actually my success. But the second, hidden demand is, whatever you do, do not outshine me. Do not become truly independent, or I will perceive you as a threat to my superiority and punish you.
It's a trap you can't win. If we look closely at the family dynamics within the research, this paradox often splits siblings into designated roles, the golden child and the scapegoat.
Ah, I've heard those terms.
Yeah, the golden child is idealized. They're forced to carry the crushing weight of the parent's unfulfilled ambitions. They receive conditional affection, but only when they perform perfectly.
And the scapegoat.
Scapegoat becomes a repository for the narcissist's projected shame. Any dysfunction in the family is just blamed on them.
And the tragedy is that both roles are forms of abuse. Neither child is loved for who they actually are. So what does this all mean when they grow up? The echo of this childhood creates adults who literally do not know where their own personality ends and someone else's begins.
Right.
Because their sense of self was hijacked, they often develop crippling, anxious, or avoidant attachment styles.
They become chronic people pleasers, equipped with this radar perfectly tuned to detect the moods of everyone in the room, constantly at the expense of their own needs.
It's exhausting just thinking about it.
It is. The data shows these children often manifest in adulthood in two extremes, either as relentless high achievers, desperately trying to earn that withheld parental love through external validation, or as profound self-saboteurs who internalize the scapegoat narrative and just give up.
And sometimes I imagine they swing violently between both.
Oh, absolutely.
So we have mapped a pretty terrifying landscape here. We've seen how the attachment system is hacked in romance, how the brain is physically altered by stress, how workplaces are drained by indirect bullying, and how children are objectified. So how does someone carrying this warped relational blueprint actually take their life back?
Well, the sources divide the solution into two distinct phases: tactical defense and internal nervous system healing.
Okay, let's start with defense.
When you are dealing with a toxic individual, you cannot entirely remove from your life, like, say, a co-parent or a manager. The premier tactical defense is the gray rock method.
Most people have probably heard of gray rocking. It's basically making yourself as uninteresting and unresponsive as a literal gray rock on the ground.
Exactly.
Giving short, neutral answers, like noted or I understand, showing zero emotional reaction. It's like playing dead when you see a bear, but for your emotions.
That's a perfect visual.
Yeah.
But the sources explain the underlying behavioral psychology of why this works, and it's brilliant. It's not just about ignoring them. If we connect this to the bigger picture, gray rocking is an applied form of a well-established behavioral modification principle called extinction.
Extinction. Okay.
Extinction dictates that if a behavior is no longer reinforced, it will eventually cease. Remember, the narcissist's ultimate goal is narcissistic supply your emotional reaction. They do not care if you're crying in devastation or screaming in rage. To them, both reactions are proof that they control your internal state. They are feeding on the energy.
So by gray rocking, you are actively cutting the supply line.
Precisely. You deny them the dopamine hit they get from manipulating you. Now, the literature warns of something called an extinction burst.
What is that?
When you first start gray rocking, the narcissist will escalate their behavior. They will push harder, say crueler things, basically trying to force the reaction they are used to getting.
Like a toddler throwing a louder tantrum when you ignore them.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
But if you hold the line, they eventually experience a deficit of supply, they lose interest, and they wander off to find an easier target.
It's an incredibly powerful shield, but it is still just a shield. You are just managing the external threat. For the people who have suffered the neurological degradation we talk about, or the adults raised in those enmeshed families, how do they cure the internal wounds?
Yeah, the internal healing is the hardest part. The sources point to something that sounds really simple but is structurally profound, and that is self-compassion.
Just being kind to yourself.
It's more than just being kind. Self-compassion is the literal neurological antidote. It is the exact polar opposite of the conditional love and relentless criticism the victim internalized. It is the active practice of offering yourself the same grace, patience, and understanding you would naturally offer to a friend in distress.
Which has to be brutally difficult for survivors. Because the narcissist essentially installed a malware program in their brain that tells them they are fundamentally unworthy of grace.
It requires immense practice, it really does. But the science supports it. Actively practicing self-compassion engages the parasympathetic nervous system. It lowers those cortisol levels, quiets the hyperactive amygdala, and allows the prefrontal cortex to come back online.
You are literally using neuroplasticity to rewrite the internal working model that the abuser broke.
Yes, you stop outsourcing your self-worth to external validators, and you reclaim your psychological autonomy.
This has been a heavy, complex, but undeniably necessary journey today. We have mapped the hidden architecture of narcissistic behavior. We've looked at how love bombing hacks the attachment system and how intermittent reinforcement physically degrades the brain's memory centers.
Hmm.
We've exposed the plausible deniability of the corporate parasite hoarding information at work, and we've traced the lifelong echoes of childhood enmeshment. And most importantly, we've explored the behavioral science of gray rocking to starve the manipulator and the neurobiology of self-compassion to heal the self.
This raises an important question, though. A final thought I want to leave with you. We established right at the beginning that narcissism is not just a rare clinical absolute. It exists on a spectrum, and we all possess baseline narcissistic traits.
Right, they're evolutionary survival mechanisms.
Exactly. So at what point do our own everyday, ego-driven actions, when we are deeply exhausted, or when we are terrified of failure, or when we are aggressively ambitious, subtly cross that line? At what point does our own unexamined behavior start chipping away at the psychological safety of the people who love and rely on us?
It really forces us to look in the mirror because you can't just look at an x-ray to see if you're being a safe partner, a supportive colleague, or an attuned parent. It isn't binary. It requires constant empathetic vigilance. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep learning, keep questioning, and keep growing. We'll see you next time.